So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about this conflict. Everyone is watching the headlines. Everyone is sharing the breaking news alerts. Everyone is talking about the military movements, the diplomatic statements, and the political reactions. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. What is this conflict actually doing to your life? What does it mean for your job, your food prices, your energy bill, your savings, your future? And the answer, when you look at it carefully, is that this is not just another regional dispute being fought in a faraway land. This conflict, the one that most of the world quietly ignored for years, the one that never made the front page, the one that world leaders kept pushing aside, has now become the trigger for the most significant reshaping of global power, global trade, and global everyday life that we have seen in decades. Depending on where you live, depending on which side of this reorientation your country falls on, your life is about to change in ways that most people have not even begun to prepare for. So today I want to walk you through exactly what this conflict is doing to the world, country by country, region by region, winner by winner, and loser by loser. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation of everything else I'm going to tell you today, is this. The entire global order for the past 50 years was built on a single, quiet assumption. That assumption was stability, not peace, not justice, not fairness, just stability. The assumption that the existing powers, the existing alliances, and the existing trade arrangements would keep functioning more or less as they always had. Goods would keep moving, energy would keep flowing, borders would stay where they were drawn, and ordinary people could get on with their lives without worrying too much about what was happening on the other side of the world. The question is no longer whether this conflict will disrupt that assumption. The question is, how deep does the disruption go, and which nations will survive it? Because this conflict, the one everyone ignored, did not start last week. It has been building for years, sometimes decades, in the background of global politics. The tensions were always there. The fractures were always widening. But because it was inconvenient, because addressing it would require difficult choices, the world's major powers kept looking the other way. And now, looking the other way is no longer an option. The ignored conflict has become impossible to ignore, and the shock waves are moving faster than most governments, most economists, and most ordinary families are prepared for. The answer to which nations survive this depends entirely on one thing. How deeply is your country woven into the old global order that is now being torn apart? The more dependent your economy is on the old arrangements, the harder the adjustment. The more self-sufficient, the more adaptable, the better positioned you are for what comes next. Let me walk you through every major region in the world with that framework in mind. On the surface, Europe looks resilient. It has strong institutions, stable democracies, large economies, and decades of experience managing global crises. It has the European Union, the most ambitious political and economic experiment in human history, and it has NATO, the most powerful military alliance the world has ever seen. But underneath that surface, Europe is facing a vulnerability that this conflict has exposed with brutal clarity. Europe built its prosperity on the assumption of cheap, reliable energy from outside its borders. For decades, it imported gas from Russia, oil from the Middle East, and manufactured goods from China. It outsourced its energy security to others and told itself that economic interdependence was a form of permanent peace. That bet has now failed. Russian gas is gone, Middle Eastern supply chains are disrupted, and European governments are now scrambling to find alternative energy sources, alternative supply chains, and alternative economic models, all at the same time, under enormous pressure, without a clear plan. The specific number that tells you everything you need to know about Europe's position. Germany, the engine of the European economy, has seen industrial energy costs rise by over 300% since 2021. 300%. German manufacturers, the companies that built precision machinery, chemicals, and automobiles that the world depended on, are now making a simple calculation. It is cheaper to produce elsewhere, and they are leaving. If German manufacturing hollows out, the entire European economic model comes under pressure. the tax base shrinks. The welfare systems that Europeans depend on become harder to fund. The political stability that Europe has taken for granted starts to crack. For ordinary European families, this conflict means higher energy bills, higher food prices, and a growing sense that the comfortable prosperity of the last 50 years was built on foundations that are no longer secure. Now let us look at a very different story, one playing out on the other side of the world. Now let us talk about China, because China is the most important and most misunderstood economic story in this entire reshaping. On the surface, China looks powerful. It has the world's second largest economy. Its military is expanding rapidly. Its diplomatic influence stretches across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It is building ports, railways, and energy infrastructure on every continent. China looks like the obvious winner of any disruption to the Western-led global order. But underneath that surface, China is carrying a vulnerability that this conflict is pressing directly on. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the Gulf. 40%. That is an enormous exposure to exactly the supply chain that this conflict is disrupting. And China's entire economic model, the model that made it one of the wealthiest nations in human history over just 40 years, is built on a single principle. Import cheap energy, use that energy to manufacture goods, and export those goods to the world. Cheap energy in, manufactured goods out. That is the entire Chinese economic model. And the conflict that everyone ignored is now threatening both ends of that equation simultaneously. China knew this model could not last forever. For 20 years, Beijing has been trying to transition toward a consumer-driven economy, one where Chinese citizens buy more goods and services domestically, and toward a technology-driven economy built on artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing. But that transition has stalled. Chinese household savings rates are running at approximately 40%, meaning ordinary Chinese families are holding tightly onto their money rather than spending it. They see the uncertainty around them, and they are protecting themselves. And the AI transition carries its own ironic problem. Artificial intelligence, the technology China is betting its future on, is itself one of the most energy-intensive technologies ever created. Training AI models, running AI systems, and powering the data centers that AI requires all consume enormous quantities of the very thing that is now disappearing. China is not going to collapse in the short term. It has strategic reserves, it has alternative energy partnerships, it has the organizational capacity of a determined state. But in the long run, China is the economy whose DNA is most mismatched with the new reality this conflict is creating. For ordinary Chinese families, the pressure is already visible, in rising prices, in slowing growth, and in a government that is becoming harder pressed to deliver the prosperity it has promised. Now let us move to the nation whose situation is perhaps the most urgent. Southeast Asia is not waiting for the consequences of this conflict to arrive. They are already here. In countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the economic disruption from this conflict is not a future scenario being discussed by economists. It is a present reality being felt by ordinary people going to work, filling up their motorcycles, and trying to keep their small businesses running. Fuel shortages are appearing. Energy rationing is being introduced. Industries built on cheap, reliable energy, manufacturing, transportation, food processing, are slowing down. Think about what Southeast Asia actually is, economically. These are nations that built their entire development model around one strategy: attract global manufacturers, provide cheap labor and cheap energy, and plug into global supply chains connecting them to consumers in America, Europe, and East Asia. It worked spectacularly for 30 years. It pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It built modern cities, modern ports, and modern middle classes where almost none existed before. But that model depends entirely on two things that this conflict is undermining: cheap imported energy to power the factories, and stable global trade routes to carry the finished goods to market. For ordinary families across Southeast Asia, this means the economic progress of the last generation feels suddenly fragile. The job at the factory, the small transport business, the restaurant that depends on affordable cooking gas, all of these are under pressure in ways that no one was fully prepared for. Now let us look at the nation that carries perhaps the most complex combination of risk and opportunity. India's story in this reshaping is one of the most compelling and most complicated of any major economy. On the surface, India looks like one of the clearest winners of any disruption to the old global order. It has the world's largest population. It has a young workforce. It has a rapidly growing technology sector. It has a democratic government that global businesses trust as a partner. For the past decade, global companies looking to reduce their dependence on China have been looking at India as the obvious alternative, a place to build supply chains, establish manufacturing, and tap into a billion-person consumer market. But India imports approximately 60% of its oil from the Gulf region. 60%. That is a structural vulnerability of extraordinary size. And this conflict is pressing directly on that vulnerability at exactly the moment India was ready to step into a much larger role in the global economy. Think about the timing. India spent years building its case as the world's next great manufacturing hub. Foreign investment was flowing in, new factories were being built, the economic story was working. And then, at precisely the moment of its greatest opportunity, the energy that powers that ambition starts to become unreliable and expensive. India's economic potential is not destroyed by this. India has too many strengths, too much momentum, and too determined a population for any single crisis to derail it permanently. But the path to realizing that potential has just become significantly harder. How India's government responds to this energy challenge, how creatively and how quickly it builds alternative energy sources, will determine whether India's economic rise happens in this decade or gets delayed by a generation. Now let us zoom out to the region with the highest human stakes of all. I want to talk about a region that almost every geopolitical conversation about this conflict completely overlooks: Africa. Africa is already the most economically vulnerable continent on Earth. Many African nations depend heavily on imported food and imported energy to sustain their populations. Their governments have limited financial reserves, their supply chains are fragile, and the margin between stability and crisis is, for millions of ordinary African families, very thin. The bombs and the missiles of this conflict fall far from African soil, but the consequences travel. When global supply chains break down, when fertilizer becomes unaffordable, when the diesel needed to transport food from farms to markets becomes too expensive, the nations that suffer most are the ones with the least capacity to absorb those shocks. And Africa, across too many of its nations, has the least cushion of any region on Earth. Serious food security analysts and economists are already warning that the worst-case scenario for parts of Africa is not just price increases or food shortages. It is famine. The kind of famine that history records in the darkest chapters. Not because anyone intended for it to happen, but because a chain of economic disruptions, each one individually survivable, can combine into something that is not. The conflict that everyone ignored is being fought in one part of the world. But the hunger it could trigger will arrive somewhere entirely different. That is something the entire world should be taking seriously. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because what this conflict is doing to the world goes much deeper than any single country's energy crisis or any single region's food prices. It is triggering something far more fundamental. For the past 50 years, the global economy has been built on a remarkably simple arrangement. The West, America, Europe, Australia, consumes. The East, China, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, produces. The Gulf provides the energy that makes production possible. And the whole system is held together by American military power, the US dollar, and an assumption of shared interest in keeping global trade flowing. This conflict is not attacking one part of that arrangement. It is stressing every part of it simultaneously. The Gulf's stability is in question. The US dollar's role as the world's universal currency is under pressure. The trade routes connecting East and West are becoming less reliable. And the political consensus that kept it all together, the quiet agreement among major powers that the system was worth maintaining, is fracturing. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. It is not only the nations that consumed who are disrupted by the end of this arrangement. The nations that produced are disrupted just as deeply. China, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, their entire economic identities, their infrastructure, their workforce skills, their industrial capacity were built around one purpose: manufacturing goods cheaply for Western consumers. That purpose is now being complicated by expensive energy, disrupted trade routes, and a West that is actively trying to reduce its dependence on Eastern supply chains. This is a reorientation for everybody, not just for the countries at the center of the conflict, not just for the major powers, but for every nation, every industry, and every ordinary family that has been living inside the global economic system that this conflict is now reshaping. The nations that thrive in what comes next will be the ones that adapt fastest, the ones that find new energy sources, build new supply chains, and develop economic models that do not depend on the arrangements that are now breaking down. The nations that keep waiting for the old system to be restored, those nations will fall behind in ways that will take a very long time to recover from. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. I want to tell you who I think the biggest long-term loser of this global reshaping will be. You might expect me to say Iran. Iran is under enormous pressure, or China with its energy vulnerability and stalling economic model, or perhaps the nations of Southeast Asia already feeling the disruption in real time. But actually, no. The biggest long-term loser of this conflict, the player whose position is most fundamentally and most permanently weakened, is the Gulf itself. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and the other Gulf states that built extraordinary wealth and global influence on the back of oil revenues and American military protection. Here's why. The Gulf states built themselves into something that looked, for a period of time, like a permanent new reality. They built gleaming cities in the middle of a desert. They created financial centers that competed with London and Singapore. They attracted wealthy residents, global businesses, and international investment. They created the appearance, a very convincing appearance, of modern, stable, cosmopolitan nations that would be at the center of the global economy for generations. But it was a structure built on two foundations that this conflict is eroding simultaneously: the flow of petrodollar wealth and the guarantee of American military protection. Remove either of those foundations, and the structure does not just weaken, it evaporates. Because a city in a desert, without oil revenues to fund its desalination plants, its air conditioning, its imported food, and its imported workforce, is not a city. It is a very expensive collection of buildings in a place where human life was never naturally sustainable. The conflict that everyone ignored has reminded the world, and reminded the Gulf states themselves, that the security and stability they projected were always more fragile than they appeared. And once that reminder has been given, once investors and residents and businesses have asked the question and arrived at an uncomfortable answer, the confidence does not come back. That is not pessimism. That is simply what history shows, again and again, about the difference between genuine resilience and borrowed stability. So let us just recap what we covered today. Europe built its prosperity on cheap imported energy and stable global trade, and both are now under serious threat. Its industrial base, led by Germany, is facing energy costs it cannot absorb without fundamental economic restructuring. China, despite its apparent economic power, is the major economy most structurally mismatched with the new reality this conflict is creating. Its entire model depends on cheap energy, and cheap energy is ending. Southeast Asia is not waiting for consequences. It is already experiencing them. Nations whose economic progress was built on cheap energy and global supply chains are feeling the disruption in real time. India has enormous economic potential, but 60% of its oil comes from the Gulf, creating a critical vulnerability at exactly the moment it was ready to step into global leadership. Africa carries the highest human stakes of all. The disruption of global food and energy supply chains threatens the most vulnerable populations on Earth with consequences that go far beyond economic difficulty. And the Gulf states, the apparent beneficiaries of an energy-driven world, are discovering that the prosperity they built was more borrowed than owned. The conflict has questioned the safety and stability that was always the foundation of their global appeal. And that confidence, once questioned, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild.